welcome to the Theology Pugcast. It's great to have you with us for this show. If this is your first show, we should introduce ourselves. I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor. I serve a church in the Pacific Northwest. I've been a real estate investor and a professor of philosophy, and I've written a few books, and my latest book is entitled In the House of Tom Bombadil. With that in mind, why don't we go to you, Tom Price?
Tom Price, that is right. I teach theology, ethics, and philosophy, and one of the places is Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary.
And now we have our jet-setting member who's just arrived at home after a trip to the Pacific Northwest, not in my neck of the woods, but a place that some of our listeners will recognize. Glenn, tell us a little bit about the yourself and your recent adventures.
Well, I'm Glenn Sunshine. I am a retired history professor. I'm a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview and a ministry associated at Reflections Ministries. And my new book is going to be coming out in mid to late March. It's called 32 Christians Who Changed Their World. It's a series of short biographies. We've got people from China, India, Japan, a couple of places in Africa, Europe, North America, South America, and Mongolia.
Wow.
So, they're from all different kinds of walks of life. They do all different kinds of things. And the point of the book is to show how you don't have to be a professional Christian like you, Chris.
I get paid to do this. Don't try it at home.
to live out your faith and to make an enormous difference in the world around you. It's a way of showing what living a biblical worldview looks like, and hopefully inspiring a little bit of it in the readers. And I was in Moscow, Idaho. It's being published by Canon Press. You should be looking pretty soon for the pre-release material on it at canon.com. Like I said, it'll be out mid to late March. I think I said that.
And you're a little tired. You haven't slept in like 48 hours.
Herein lies the problem. I was supposed to come back yesterday via Minneapolis. And for those of you who pay attention to the weather, that will tell you when I didn't come back. The major snowstorm up there. So they had to reroute me, and there was no good way to do it around the snowstorm. So I got up at, it was about 5:00 Pacific time yesterday, 8:00 Eastern time, and I just got home an hour ago. That's 8 in the morning, So.
Yeah, and you've dozed on the plane, but not really slept.
Right.
It's hard to sleep on planes.
I don't sleep on planes. I actually dozed after I got here.
So if you nod off in the middle of the show, we'll forgive you, and we'll nudge you. We'll have Lynn come over and nudge you.
Yeah. So if I end up yawning or something like that, it's not because I'm bored. Trust me. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Right. Well, it's my day today for the subject of the day, and hopefully it'll keep you engaged. I think it will, Glenn. So I want to talk about the notorious Klaus Schwab. I don't want to, focus in just on, his kind of Bond villain kind of persona or the World Economic Forum and its machinations. I'm more interested in a statement that everyone knows Klaus made, or at least was made by the World Economic Forum, that just caused people to scratch their heads and say, what are these people thinking? Where are they coming from? And that statement is, you will own nothing and you will be happy. Now, there is a lot packed into that statement in the sense that there are certain assumptions about human nature, certain assumptions about happiness that are operative beneath the surface here that I think would be, good to bring to the surface. So that's what I'd like us to talk about. The title of the show today, people have already seen the title, but in the course of our conversation, it should wait. But let's explore this a little bit. Now, so each of you, when you
hear,
I
make a general statement first? As a general rule of thumb, whenever someone proposes some sort of sweeping restructuring of society, my answer is always after you.
Yes.
And if they refuse to take the lead on it,
Right.
I am not, so all these people, I mean, I just saw James Cameron was saying that, Thanos was onto something. We could really lose about 50% of the people on the planet. After you, Jim.
Yeah.
And I would say the same thing to Charles Schwab. You want to own nothing? Feel free. Show me how it's done.
You mean Klaus Schwab? Charles Schwab is the guy that wants you to buy things.
Right. Yeah. Sorry, Klaus. I haven't slept much. But it's going to be a great excuse, this show.
That's right. That's right. Well, let's dig into it a little bit. So Tom, what do you see as sort of the tacit definition of a human being that apparently Schwab thinks to be the case? So, in other words, what are we?
Yeah, we're surface level and base, we're as basic as you can get. Basically, material creatures that pleasure is kind of the highest good, and that as long as we can, and the mix that in with the modern notion of the self, which ironically is not always consistent with materialism, but it's this very notion that we can choose certain kinds of things that will make us happy and give us pleasure. And so if we can pick our identity or sexuality or what makes us satisfied on that particular level, whatever else is out there, really, any higher good is insignificant.
Yeah, or just doesn't exist, or because if it did, if it were truly higher, then it could require things of us, make demands upon us. Yeah. Any thoughts, Glenn?
Yeah, it's worth noting that going back to Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That was originally in John Locke, life, liberty, and property.
Right. Yeah.
But Jefferson snuck property in sort of in that phrase, pursuit of happiness. Yeah. Because Jefferson was using happiness as a translation of the Greek word eudaimonia, which means a life well lived, a life of virtue and all of that, and a life of excellence. And the trick is that Jefferson firmly believed that in order to achieve eudaimonia, you had to have property.
Yeah, that was actually one of the preconditions for the franchise at that time. I mean, they assumed that only property owners, I don't know if assumed is the right term. I think they were of the conviction that only property owners should have the franchise.
Right. And the reason for that is they've got something to lose. They're less likely to make rash decisions.
Right. Yeah. It's easy to spend other people's money. It's not so easy to spend your own. Right.
Yeah.
So anyway, I think all those things are true and in play. But I think it also kind of gets at what we've seen with regard to the rise of and the triumph of the modern self, as our friend, Carl Trueman has put it, in which it's kind of this psychological, I guess, or maybe an island of consciousness that we are in this sort of sea of unmeaning. So it's very, very Kantian man kind of way of understanding human beings is that, we're not really sure what consciousness is, although we're absolutely convinced it's material in character. which says something. But we don't know what it is. We can't replicate it. When we try to sort of recreate it virtually using computers, there's a part of us that says, wow, look at that. It's conscious. And there's another part of us that says, of course it isn't conscious. It's just a bunch of algorithms and a vast memory drawing on a range of sort of catchphrases. But anyway.
But actually, that's how they think anybody who believes, most people who follow transhumanist ideas, that's what they think our brain is.
That's right. Yeah, I think that's
ultimately,
right.
We did a show on this a couple of years back, but it's a faulty way of understanding the human mind. It really doesn't work. The simple question that I would want to ask is if ChatGPT is conscious, what's it doing when you don't give it an input?
Yeah. Is it dreaming? Is it scheming?
The android dream of electric sheep. I mean, yeah.
Right. Hopefully it's not scheming. Otherwise, we're in a whole heap of trouble. But, yeah, I think that's all right. So, but this is, of course, very different than older notions of what it meant to be a human being, or what it meant to dwell in the world, or even what thought consisted of. So, even the term consciousness has a kind of contemporary feel. It's not the way people would speak of sort of the unseen dimensions of ourselves in the past. In the past, to address that kind of dimension of our lives, we'd talk about, we use words like soul or spirit or even intellect or mind. We wouldn't use consciousness. Consciousness, in my mind, conveys a sense of like a television screen or something that's kind of on, or not.
If I'm not mistaken, we really owe that way of thinking of ourselves to Freud.
Okay,
Because
yeah.
Freud drew the distinction between the conscious, which is what we are aware of within ourselves, and the unconscious, which is the thing that actually controlled us, that we were not really aware of.
Yeah. We've talked a little bit about that with regard to, 19th century thinkers who really maintained, as you know, that it's kind of what's really important or really operative is irrational, sort of the irrational, whether we're talking about Nietzsche or Freud or Marx or what have you. But anyway, yeah.
Well, in this notion that, you definitely see it break into, I mean, it comes through the West, and you have some early kind of stepping stones towards it, and I think in good ways from a lot of the Western theological tradition. But when it gets distorted, you definitely get a picture like after Descartes, where it's really a becoming conscious of oneself as a thinking subject, right? That you are standing, you're not participating in reality in its intelligible ordering towards the good, if you will, but you are somehow removed and over against it, and somehow distinct from it. And therefore, you have the ability to impose on it, but a part of it all the same, and being imposed upon by it. So it is very conflictual at its core.
Yeah, and it's got kind of an inner loop kind of dynamic. What are you thinking about when you're doing what Descartes is talking about? You're thinking about your consciousness. You're thinking about yourself. You got this sort of self-contained loop. So you're stranded in your head. So basically, modern philosophy is the story of kind of like being imprisoned in your self, and the world outside yourself is either something that you impose yourself upon, or you flee from. But so so this is kind of the modern way of conceiving now of things. Now, what that also means is that this sort of stuff that occupies your mind in terms of your desires, your appetites, your passions, the challenge when we think of ourselves in this way is, how do we sort all that out? Is there any way to prioritize, things, or is it an arbitrary exercise? I choose this over that in terms of significance and importance. Particularly, if the thing that is at work in you, say a passion, is strong, and it's hard for you to control. Do you still try to control it, or do you kind of give yourself over to it? If you try to control it, why? What's the motive for controlling it? If everything is just sort of in this sort of soup of consciousness and has no inherent importance, sort of to order one thing over another, except maybe in the most utilitarian, pragmatic sense. So obviously, if you want to win a marathon, you don't eat everything that you desire to eat. But you have chosen to win the race, and so that gives you the telos that you need in order to order your inner life and your daily routine and so forth. But there's nothing intrinsically valuable that would require everybody to run a marathon. That's just something that you chose to do. And who are you to tell me that I shouldn't give myself over to, I don't know, drinking 30 beers a day, sleeping with animals? You know what I'm getting at.
The list goes on.
Right. Any thoughts on that?
I think one of the things you see here is how far removed, again, I mean, from a Christian point of view, is how removed from the solidities that we have from the past we have really, that's where we are now. Basically, we're far removed. I mean, one is this notion that our choice and our freedom and our self, for that matter, what we are, could ever be detached from an orientation to the good. The very fact that, as a Christian, that which we owe everything to, the source of all goodness, God, is our inmost, the inmost reality that grounds our being. And also the fact that because God transcends our being, is the end, the highest good to which our being is oriented naturally, I'm talking apart from the fall, then our will is already, if you will, enacted within a movement and direction of the creature, and the gift the creature is towards the source of all goodness. So to rip the creature from that thick reality and then put the burden on it as though it could actually choose what the good is or what it isn't, choose the meaning of the goods and their significance and purposes arbitrarily, and then somehow choose between them based on whatever they happen to autonomously or freely or enslavedly want at the moment. It's radical delusion. You're not living in reality, and the consequences for the human and their relations and their society and everything else is destructive. There's no way out of it, and that's what the fall, of course, is. It's basically the resistance to receiving the good as gift and being grateful and thankful and turning to the creature to give us all the pleasures, and rather than the creator. And hence we move from doxological man to idolatrous man.
Right. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah. I hope you're going to use that in one of your books that you're working on.
Yeah, I'm actually using it tonight.
Right. Well, the title of today's show is something I've worked into the book I'm working on right now. So I'm giving a little bit of it away. But any thoughts, Glenn? I can see you there kind of amused.
I'm struck by the parallelism, and this is, coming off of some of what Tom is saying. I'm struck by the parallelism between this and the whole LGBTQIAXYZ plus whatever it is.
4, 8, 9. I think there's some numbers in there now.
Yeah. There's a 2S I know, and a couple of other things, but because what that says is that as a human being, you are unmoored from anything in this world.
Yeah,
you are completely what you decide you are. Yeah. And that can change. It's fluid. It can be whatever it is you want it to be at any particular moment in time, because you are actually unmoored from the physical world. You are in. I can't think of anything more terrifying, frankly, than the idea that you are just sort of out there in the void with nothing to provide any kind of structure or anything else to understanding who you are. It's up to you completely to make that up. Yeah. And in the same way, I think that what this statement, the statement is, Schwab's statement is pointing to the idea that it's not only that you yourself are unmoored from the physical world, you don't have to, even in your economic life, even in your life enacted in this world, you don't have to have any connection to the world itself. You don't have to own anything. You don't have to, whatever you need will be provided for you, and you will be happy, whatever happy means.
Yeah, I get the image of a caged animal who learns how to push the little button that releases the food or the water, and that's kind of the image I have of what they have in store for us. But before I get into that delightful image, with any more specificity, I want to think a little bit about kind of the odd, or sort of the relevance of this, not just at a personal level, but at the level of just social order and law. So I think we're on the cusp of a significant pushback against transgenderism at the legal level. So I think the lawsuits will start with a trickle and then become a flood. I think that we may end up with class action lawsuits and huge sort of conflict surrounding how much these people will need to be compensated. I don't know how it'll all end, but it seems inevitable to me. But what this does is it forces us to deal with the meaning of health, the meaning of male and female, meaning of biology, and not just sort of retreat into the subjective. Because, as you noted, Glenn, when things are this fluid, one day you think you're a woman, the next day you realize you're a man. But you've made some decisions in the meantime with the encouragement of some pretty significant people who had the power to serve your delusion. And then you realize, I have permanently damaged myself. I've sterilized myself. I've altered my physical state in such a way that I'm going to have to live with what happened for the rest of my life. And I was deceived. I was too young to make that kind of choice. I was not mentally stable enough to make that kind of choice. People who should have known better should have come to my aid and helped me through these struggles rather than cater to them. All that stuff's going to come into play.
Yeah. Well, and I think especially, you see it very much in the therapy world now, where they take it, they're indoctrinated at this point. Basically, the minute they hear any kind of incongruity with an identity, that, it must therefore be they need to transition. And they encourage it younger and younger, it's terrifying, because the very sources you would go to look for someone to say, let's be patient and play this kind of thing out. This is people, especially in a world for which, there are no more boundaries that we can push up against, and it's everyone's anxious because they don't know they don't have any kind of exemplars that give that kind of boundary that we need to actually be a functioning, flourishing human being. So we don't know roles at all. We've broke down every hierarchy, even in the business world, where you go into a job now. If the new hire is offended by the way that the structure of the company is by the head up, they get the higher say, So you have all of this, and this all falls back on, the young person, and they're like, what do I do? Who am I? And then they see someone they trust to help them sort it out. And all of a sudden they're, I am. I must be born in the wrong body because something doesn't make sense here. And the insanity that we could get to this point, of course, we've been tracing the history of it and really the demonic roots of it, idolatrous roots. But this is where it's no longer, as we talked about in a previous episode, it's no longer about treating a sick body. It is really about basically treating healthy bodies with sick souls that do need the care of souls. They do need love and patience, but they also need truth.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, I didn't mean to really derail this into transgenderism. The point that I'm trying to make, to take a word from your title, which you haven't actually stated yet, but it is in the show notes, they see us as plastic creatures, as creatures that are functionally infinitely malleable into anything.
Yeah.
Well, into anything. The LGBT thing says that our bodies aren't what's important. We're infinitely malleable. We can turn it into whatever we want to. Reproduction isn't what sex is for. All of these things, there's no teleology there. All of these kinds of things that you see in that movement, I think, are implicit in Schwab's statement, taking it beyond just the issue of sex and gender and turning it into let's ask a question. What is happiness? What does that really mean? And Schwab seems to think you can mold people into an idea of happiness that is, again, untethered from material conditions, if I can use a word from Marx.
Yeah, I think that's right. So let's dig into that. So what's implicit here, as we've noted, is some understanding of human nature. So the title of the show, of course, is "Are You a Plastic Pleasure Monkey?"
Yeah.
And before I dig into that, though, let's step back into the older understanding. So obviously, we're Christians. We have been educated in the Western tradition of Christendom. We embrace that, but it's, I think, also important to point to the fact that we have other authorities in antiquity that are outside the Christian tradition who also agree with us about certain important things. And an example would be someone like Aristotle. Speaking to the subject of happiness, I think this is significant. But what you had with Plato and others in antiquity is a sense that the human being is a composite of things. There are different things that go into making up, who and what we are. Our bodies, obviously, are really important in that mix, but we're not simply material creatures or just animals in the sense that there's not some sort of unseen dimension to us that's really important. There is, a dimension to us that accompanies our bodies, dwells in our bodies, but the way the kind of the taxonomy of a healthy human being in that tradition puts it or understands it is that we're tripart. There are the appetites. Certainly, those need to be satisfied in order for us to just exist, food, etc. Then there are the passions or the affections, which are related to the appetites, but also related to something else. And then there's the intellect. And the intellect is not simply just a calculating machine. The intellect is really the place where the highest self is known and makes its judgments. That particular dimension of our lives is informed by and enjoys the appetites and the passions, but the intellect as a prudential faculty that's judging and ordering is keeping everything in its proper place and serving some higher good, whether that higher good is understood to be the welfare of the city, the welfare of a household, physical health, or even the gods, if we're still in the pagan setting.
Yeah. Now, a couple of comments here. First of all, you use different words, but I suspect our readers will be familiar, or our listeners, our listeners will be familiar with this if they are at all through The Abolition of Man, where Lewis uses the head, the belly, and the chest. The interesting thing about that is that by going back to ancient Greek philosophy, he's actually also undermining the very books that he is critiquing. I mean, because they completely reject this way of looking at the world.
Right.
But there's another component here that you have to include, because in the ancient world, I think the closest thing that they had to what we call happiness was embodied by the goddess Fortuna, fortune.
Right.
And Fortuna had a wheel. And the image of the Wheel of Fortune doesn't just go to game shows, it goes back to the ancient world. And the idea is that fortune is very fickle. Sometimes you're up, sometimes you're down. You're never going to stay up all the time. It's always going to spin.
Yeah.
And so they understood that, like I said, I think that's the closest thing that we've got to the concept of happiness. And they were certainly grateful when fortune favored them, but they never expected that to last, and thus they never made that anything resembling the purpose of life, because they knew it was going to betray them if they tried to do that. There's an enormous difference between Fortuna on the one hand and Beata on the other, blessedness.
Yeah. I think too that related to that, the strategies that they developed, particularly in the Stoic and Epicurean schools, were intended to kind of defang fortune. I don't think that the Stoics were like Mr. Spock, emotionalists, although I do think that the Stoics were the inspiration for Mr. Spock on Star Trek and the whole Vulcan scene. But I think what they knew is that, yes, even though you enjoy these pleasures, these goods, which are undeniably worth enjoying, you can't rely on them to be there regularly. And so you need to develop the inner resources, the inner strength necessary to forgo them if they're not readily at hand. And you shouldn't spend a lot of time pursuing them. That's basically true for both the Epicureans and the Stoics. And I think sometimes people don't catch the sort of the self-control that's at work within the Epicurean school.
Right. The Epicureans were not hedonists.
Right.
Yeah. It might actually be worth sometime down the line doing a show on Boethius' Consolation of Philosophy, because that really hits this hard.
Yeah. Well, another book, and I've yet to read it, but the title intrigues me because we normally associate the Apostle Paul with Stoicism, but there's actually a book out there that's out of print that's advocating that Paul was influenced by the Epicureans as well. And it gets into that. But anyway, just to plant that seed, if anybody in Pugcast land has that book and you wouldn't mind letting me borrow it, I'd be really grateful. So how does this all relate to happiness? Well, for Christians, as well as pagans in antiquity, the properly ordered life, whether it's to the glory of God or just simply prudently ordered so that you don't run afoul of, just the good ordering of your own life or mess yourself up, requires the exercise of judgment, self-control, the virtues that we normally, promote, that I don't think people like Schwab are all that interested in. They have a different understanding of the human being, and I really do think you can summarize their understanding, as I noted before with the title of the show, Are You a Plastic Pleasure Monkey? We've already gotten into the plasticity of the human being. And because there's this deep conviction, I think it's a conviction, that the human is not anything normative, but is to be transcended. Improved upon. This is where transhumanism comes into play. It's kind of fun to go back and look at, say, evangelical apologetical literature, apologetics from the 70s and 80s, where everybody was super concerned with secular humanism. Those were the good old days. We could only have secular humanism back. Now we've got godless transhumanism, which I do think grows out of a secular humanism, but it's actually a repudiation of humanism, just period.
Yeah.
Because even the secular humanists were kind of being propelled by the fumes of Christianity. Their engines were still firing along those lines because they had some assumptions about the way the world worked and what human beings are that they inherited from Christianity.
Right. I think it was G.K. Chesterton described it as borrowed capital.
Yeah.
Well,
that's right.
And what you have there is, again, the repeated cry of Christianity over and over again is that you have just a bad type of transcendence going on, one that isn't really transcendent. And the brilliant gift of Christianity's to the world, besides many things, was its gift of transcendence. That the human being doesn't need to increase in terms of being transformed into something it isn't in terms of the goodness of its creaturely human nature, in order to be connected to eternity and their perfected and fulfilled happiness and life. It is something that occurs with that nature, bringing that nature to its fullness, not somehow transcending it in the sense of becoming something other or altering it in a something that is going to basically throw it off as just something not significant and good. This is why we have resurrection of the body at the heart and no conflict, right? There is transcendence, true transcendence, but one that doesn't begrudge the creature its embodiedness,
Yeah.
even if it has a higher aim of communion with God in its spiritual life that goes the happiness where the happiness is most deeply found.
Yeah.
But at the same time, well, I think that there's a certain incoherence in the worldview that we're talking about here. Not the Christian one, the other one. One of the phrases that you'll hear people say is "get over yourself," or "he's so full of himself," or something like that. On the one hand, we want people not to be self-centered and egotistical and all of that. And on the other hand, we want them to determine what's good for them, what makes them happy and all of that, and to pursue that. So which is it? Are we to pursue ourselves, or are we to get over ourselves?
Yeah.
The get over ourselves is actually closer to the Christian ideal, because we never reach that true state of happiness that Tom is talking about unless we die to ourselves.
Yeah.
When Bonhoeffer, when God calls a person, he calls them to come and die. That is fundamental. That denial of yourself is fundamental to Christian ethics. And yet it's exactly the opposite direction that, ethics, it's even more than ethics, but it's exactly the opposite in the world. But at the same time, they still recognize that it's not good to pursue yourself so much that you sort of alienate the people around you because you're so selfish, egotistical, and so on. You're so vain. You probably think this song is about you. That's not a good thing. And yet at the same time, it's almost exactly what they're telling people to do.
Yeah, you're right. It's incoherent, and it does I think demonstrate that kind of we're still in a Christ-haunted culture. Sometimes people refer to the Christ-haunted South. I think the West is still Christ-haunted in general.
Yeah.
I don't think we'll be able to say that the haunting has ever ended, because I do think Christianity has fundamentally changed a number of things in terms of what we expect out of life and what we expect from ourselves, but we can't really explain it very well. And that's why it's incoherent.
Yeah, in some sense, Christ fills all things and has filled all things in the sense of there isn't any space that has not been claimed by Christ, isn't being aimed for being united to Christ. But the other hand is this is why different thinkers have said nihilism is the nothing is the only territory that where people think they can go, which isn't anything anyway. But it shows you why the flip side of rejecting it is to have nothing. we end up there rather than everything. But you do have this you do have also with the rejection. And we've talked about the long process of a certain rejection of a lot of things Christianity did give, or a redefining of them and replacing them. And I mean, for example, the coherence of the creation as it's ordered to the good. Now, today we look for intelligibility down, if we can find it in a cell or in certain places. But the ancients and the early Christians, they saw it as the harmonious whole, in the fact that you have so many things in creation that have bestowed on them gifts and goodness for everything else. That the flourishing of humankind and everything else is kind of it goes against the grain, if you will, of those things that look like death and everything else, that should have swallowed everything up. But here you have still a creation flourishing and having all of this resource. And so that is prior to us. That intelligibility, that wisdom stamped in things is prior to our choosing, and it is determinative of us in some way. And so we really have to rip ourselves out of that and basically say there isn't anything ordered to the good within creation. It really is just like, a perverted sense of the self, the fallen self, that it is about gratification of myself or that selfish desire to basically be gods in a way that brings everything under our our direct ruling.
Yeah, getting back to my, question, are you a plastic pleasure monkey? We've explored the plasticity of human nature a little bit. I want to look at the other two terms. Monkey obviously is intended to get at the notion that we're merely animals, that there's no sense in which we're participating in a reality that can't be reduced to the animal. So human beings. Sometimes people will say that guy's walking around with his head in the clouds. Well, human beings in the Christian understanding have always had their heads in the clouds. Every single human being, whether or not they're theologians or philosophers or just kids playing baseball. I mean, what we have is a dimension to ourselves that can't be reduced to the operations of nature per se. If that were the case, we are the most overcompensated creatures in the world. I mean, there are dimensions to our lives that just can't be reduced to survival, and they're the richest part of our lives. In other words, they're not just sort of like icing on the cake; they're the cake. They're the substance of what makes life worth living.
We can attune to the intelligible aspects of the wisdom that is an ingredient within the whole of creation. I mean, this is really where that is what gets severed once realism starts to go and the rest in the West. And this is ultimately after Darwin. I mean, then when you are sort of, your intelligibility is basically a survival mechanism for how you can negotiate kind of the material environment around you and survive. I mean, that's the extent of it.
Yeah.
I still hear this today.
Yeah. We have to be careful here, though. In traditional Christian understandings of this, like you see in Lewis, for example, when we talk about it being intelligible, we don't mean simply that it's rational.
Right.
That it can be understood in rational terms. Lewis said that the intellect is the organ of understanding, but the imagination is the organ of meaning.
Yeah.
And I just finished a book, which I'll probably do a podcast on eventually, by Malcolm Guite called Lifting the Veil. Guite is a theologian and poet, and he discusses imagination and the arts in this book. And what he says that the imagination does is it unites the earthly and the heavenly, that it brings the spiritual and the physical, or however you want to use whatever terminology you want to use, it brings them together so that you use earthly things to describe the heavenly, or you start with the heavenly and then get to the earthly from there, and you unite the two of them in what you're doing. And that's part of this intelligibility. It's not. It involves to some extent intuition. It involves a whole lot of other things rather than just the intellect.
It's not rational. Yeah, this is something worth noting. Rationalism isn't what the classic Christianity meant by reason. That there's a whole history there. It was very full, in which truth, beauty, and goodness are integrated, because of the way the non-necessity of creation, that it is a theater of God's glory. So our closest, actually, that's why worship, if you want to talk about the heart of what the best form of human correspondence to that divine wisdom, it's worship, which includes all of those aspects and their limits.
Yeah, and then this all ties in, of course, to Logos, which I think holds it all together. And when the ancients thought about, the intellect, that was a participation in the Logos, which is external to ourselves. It is suffusing reality, including us, and that's why we can participate in it. It's kind of like the way the Force is described by Obi-Wan Kenobi. Anyway, I won't get into that too much. But the idea that it's all around us, it's suffusing, it's ordering reality. It is the sort of the essence of reality. What I want to do now, though, is I want to step back and think about, okay, if human beings are made up of these various dimensions or components, then how do we understand happiness? So happiness is not simply pleasure or a kind of euphoric state that you just can kind of nuzzle in or sort of hunker down in or get comfortable in. If that were the case, then we would be like, Cypher in that film, The Matrix, who says, I know that this is all just simulated reality, but who cares? It's better than the real world itself. And he's basically bought the sort of notion that we've been talking about, the island of the consciousness, or islands of consciousness in a sea of unknowing.
Yeah.
But I think the older view, which Aristotle had, is you could kind of say that Aristotle identified happiness as a kind of an engine with cylinders. So an old-fashioned internal combustion engine has cylinders. Someday that will be a thing of the past if Elon Musk and his friends have their way, but it still is an illustration that works for anybody as a gearhead today. So you've got cylinders that are firing. So you've got your appetites, you've got your affections, you have sort of this other dimension of our lives that we've just been talking about, the intellect, the imagination, spiritual dimension of our lives that is sort of the whole. All of these things have to be firing in order for a person to be happy. Because with Aristotle, potential and actual, this whole idea that these potentialities that we have, in these various features of our lives, all have to be at work. Now, there are certain implications to this which are fascinating to consider. One of those implications is some people by nature can be happier than others, but the people who are less happy would never know the difference. In other words, so if you got like an 8-cylinder engine and your friend has a 4-cylinder engine, that person can be firing on all 4 cylinders and be as happy as that person can possibly imagine being. But you, because you've got an 8-cylinder engine, have a greater capacity for happiness, but you also have a greater capacity for failing. And in other words, you could be firing on 3 cylinders and be an 8-cylinder engine and be absolutely miserable.
Yeah, or you could be firing on 5 cylinders and be miserable, whereas the guy firing on 4 cylinders is perfectly happy.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it kind of is kind of a kind of catch-22, I suppose. But anyway, so this is the thing. So now with Aristotle, he identified a certain number of pistons. What the Christian faith is able to note is that you've missed some of the more important ones, Aristotle. Yeah. If you really want to be happy, you need to serve the glory of God, which is not something that's in Aristotle's framework.
Well, that becomes that's where the Christians, the early Christians in particular, Aquinas later, and then this for those out there who want a fresh book, this book here just came out by the Davenant guys, interpretation. Oh, yeah. I mean, an up to date kind of reading of it. Thomas Traherne's The Shining Human Creature, which basically does exactly what you're doing, engages the tradition towards happiness, but that reorients it and patterns it towards the Christian transcendent end. That's his whole work. It only goes so far. Christianity addresses kind of something the rest can't, even though that aims towards it. And one of the things I think he gets after, and this is classic Christian, is that joy is that transcendent aspect that we're made for, the joy that is God's own life. God exists eternally in, we use the term happiness, but in eternal joy, when where a shared communion of love, of infinite perfection and giving. There is nothing missing there. And that the sheer joy of that existence is what we as creatures were created to partake of.
Yeah.
And that's why the joy of heaven, you hear the angels break through and that song of heaven breaks through. Why? And then in suffering, I mean, what is it that Christian can count it all joy to suffer? Well, how could you call it all joy to suffer, unless you're kind of a sick, Schwab type person?
This is where the word happiness, I think, trips us up. Mm-hmm. Because like I said before, I think when we use happiness, we're thinking of fortuna,
yeah,
fortune, whereas the sense of happiness that we're using here is much closer to Aristotle's eudaimonia, which is not a word that we're really familiar with, and it's not a concept we're familiar with. So the word happiness, that's why I was struggling to find a word in Latin or Greek that really translates to happiness as we've got it, and there is, as we think of it, and I couldn't find one, and as I was sort of running through my vocabulary cards in my head. You got beata, blessed, makarios in Greek. You've got that, but that's not really happiness. Whatever Schuller has in his "Be Happy" attitudes, it's not. It's not. It's not happiness. It's not what it is.
Yeah, you just dated yourself in a major way there, Glenn. I've used Robert Schuller with certain people to illustrate certain things, and they're like, "Who are you talking about?" Which is
we can be grateful.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, we can be grateful, but it also demonstrates just how fleeting fame is. He was like the biggest, thing on the block for the longest time.
Or to put it simply, there are people who translate the blessed are the poor in spirit as happy are the poor in spirit. No.
Right.
Yeah. Makarios beata, it does not mean happy the way we use it. Yeah. And Tom, I mean, you're absolutely right when you're talking about the happiness that is found in union with God. But what that is again not the way we typically use the word happy.
Yeah, that's why I tend to use joy more, only because it has the capacity to it's not like a birthday party where you got your favorite gift and then 2 weeks later you realize you need something else, right? It is that enduring, lasting fullness where we are brought to our fullness, completion. I mean, if you think of what creation is, right? We are a movement at every moment from nothingness towards the infinite that God is. We are that which is suspended between that by God. Yeah. And so we have our natures, but they are directed towards God. Of course, they're fallen redemption, but the point of redemption is reunited to God, where we are brought, where that which is lacking in us, because we aren't complete in and of ourselves, is always finding its deeper and deeper fulfillment, or to use what Chris was talking about, where all the potential we were created to be and have is increasingly realized as God communicates those goods and gifts to us towards our fullness of joy. And so creation itself, one could say, is basically God's pure desire to share joy with that which otherwise is nothing.
Yeah. I like the way you put that too, Tom, that we're sort of in this in-between space between nothingness and full reality or full actuality. And I remember hearing, I think it was Nate Wilson, Doug's son, sometime back, talking about creation from nothing. And his point was that this is an ongoing thing. It's not like just over. In other words,
absolutely,
that and maybe this is something that physicists are dipping into as they go, down to the very smallest elements of the physical world. What they're discovering is they're not really sure what matter is anymore. A lot of those guys are like, wow, there's like, when you get down that small, things get pretty mystical.
Yeah, stinking weird is the phrase I would use. Apparently there are subatomic particles that wink into and out of existence.
It's like, that's what I'm getting at. There's just this sense that we're on sort of this boundary line when you get that small, that actually reflects this idea that creation from nothing is an historic event. It happened in the past, but it's also happening on an ongoing basis right now.
And the interesting thing, one of the things I've been thinking about lately on this is sort of the intersection of metaphysics and epistemology in Christ.
Yeah.
So Christ is the Logos. We talk about that all the time. That's sort of an epistemological concept. But he's also the one through whom all things were created, for whom all things were created, who holds all things together, and who upholds everything by his powerful word.
Right.
So he is fundamental to reality. He is fundamental to knowledge. John says that he is the light that enlightens every man that comes into the world.
Yeah.
So even the pagans, what knowledge they have is mediated by Christ.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He is central to everything.
Yeah. And this is a dimension to Christology that, generally speaking, evangelical theologians, certainly pastors, don't do anything with.
And
I can't remember the last time that I heard a pastor address these things that wasn't me.
It hasn't been. It has not been really. I mean, again, there are theologians somewhat in the academic world that have been beating that drum for a long time, but it really has had a hard time finding its way into the church, in general. And I think one of the keys is, I mean, everything that I do when I talk about creation is through the lens of the incarnation and the Trinity. It's through the church's reflection on the significance for how we conceive of God and creation in that light, in the fullness of God as an eternal, perfect communion of love, and that light. But it's the incarnation that's the linchpin there, and that it's the incarnation that grounds the church's ability, therefore, to if you will, redeem philosophy in the sense of bringing what, like Glenn was saying, what is true in it into the purifying light of Christ, ripping it from what doesn't really belong to the truth, and then attaching it to that which is the fullest sense of truth, Christ himself. And this is part of Christ filling all things through the ministry and work of the church.
Right.
Yeah, I think the Orthodox and to maybe a lesser extent the Catholics do this much better than Protestants and especially evangelicals do. Especially American evangelicals, we're very pragmatic. We're utilitarian. And the reason why pastors don't talk about this is that people will walk away in the pews saying, "So what? What has this got to do with me?" I mean, they wouldn't be quite that crass, but that's more or less what they're thinking. What can I do with this?
And this is why they don't know what it has to do with their child who's cutting themselves up.
Well, but I think that maybe we're kind of turning a corner on this stuff. I do think that there are more and more just regular folks in the pews that are just puzzled. What is going on?
Yeah.
Every week at my church, we have new people. I mean, the church, every week we're bringing in new members. What's going on? Well, I wish we could say that we're, this great evangelistic dynamo in our community. There's some of that, but what I think is really happening is a lot of people are like, I haven't heard my pastor address kind of the fundamental matters that help me to understand what in the world is going on around here. And people are looking for insight, help, that kind of thing. So, and they're kind of trying to find that, and we're benefiting from as a church that kind of growth. I think that I know, like in your case, Tom, you talk about this stuff all the time, and I've been in settings where people have listened to you and have come away saying, "Wow, that answers a lot of questions that I didn't even know I was struggling with."
Glenn, you were saying something?
Yeah, I not wanting to pat ourselves on the back too much, but I think that one of the things that the size of audience that we have on the Pugcasts tells us is how much the church has been lowballing Christians. They haven't been addressing these kinds of issues. And I think one of the reasons we've got so many people isn't because we're such sparkling personalities. Mm-hmm. It's because we're actually but that isn't the key here. The important thing is that we're addressing questions nobody really seems to want to talk about. Because they don't think people are interested, or they don't think they can handle it, or something. I don't know.
But maybe they just don't know enough themselves, I'm afraid to say.
Yeah. But I mean, like I said, I'm not saying this to pat ourselves on the back, but I think it's illustrative of what's needed.
Yeah. And it is. I have found it hard. It is hard to move from, because a lot of it is heady and can be academic, and that's just because having to dig into it in the layers of what have led to it is not easy. Plus, Christianity worked through a lot of these things in huge debates and rigorous terminology. Not everybody has access to unpack it, and they usually get so skeptical of it the minute it sounds above that kind of simplistic, easy to digest truth. And really, these truths require rigor and purification of ourselves in many ways to really learn and listen to what the church has been trying to teach us for a long time, not uncritically, of course, in the light of the fullness of Scripture, but taking that wisdom and saying, wait a minute, we do have resources. They're just not easy to access. Others have been maybe better at accessing them. It's our time now, too.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, why don't we wrap it up on that note? So the question, the rhetorical question of the show is, are you a plastic pleasure monkey? And the answer is no. You are made in the image of God, and that's not just Hallmark greeting card, material. Mm-hmm. I think sometimes we treat it that way. It is full. That truth is full of meaning that you can spend your entire life exploring and trying to find ways to actualize in your life, to use, Aristotelian language. Anyways, well, why don't we just say a few things as we conclude? We do thank you for getting to the end of this show, and we want you to know that we are grateful to Trinity Reformed Church in Huntsville, Alabama. We now are part of their podcast network, and we're glad to be part of that. We continue to be part of the Fight, Laugh, Feast podcast network. We're glad that our shows are available there. You can get access to our show in lots of different places like Spotify and Apple Podcasts and so forth. But if you're interested in kind of following us more closely on an ongoing basis, we have some Facebook pages where people post funny memes about us, and we've got
the Grumblers.
Yeah, got the Grumblers. We also have a new Twitter account, which we've been loath to take advantage of and post things with. But we do have people who are going to be doing that for us. We're even in the early stages of kind of getting an Instagram account up and going. The problem is that we're very forgetful guys, and we forget to share stuff in those places. But hopefully, going forward, we'll have some people who help us with those things. So if you want to follow us on any of those social media platforms, we welcome you to do that. Also, if you want to support us monetarily, we have a Patreon account, and we have a number of faithful supporters who keep the doors open, so to speak, because there are expenses with the show, and we're grateful to the folks who do give to us on a regular basis. And if you'd like to become one of those people, we'd appreciate it. Anyway, all those things said, thanks a lot, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
The Theology Pugcast is a ministry of Trinity Reformed Church in Huntsville, Alabama. If you like this podcast, you might also enjoy the new book by Jason Cherry, The Making of Evangelical Spirituality, now available on Amazon.